Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Baker Institute. I want to thank you all for coming to tonight's program. I'm Amy Jaffe. I am the Wallace S. Wilson Fellow for Energy Studies here at the Baker Institute, and I lead our program called the Energy Forum, which is a multifaceted program designed to promote innovative research and debate on the subject of energy policy, energy geopolitics, and energy and science technology policy. We have a great lineup of panelists tonight to discuss tonight the subject of U.S. Energy security, looking at our energy policy in the United States. I know sometimes it looks a little discouraging when we see the debate and look at the great challenges that face us. So we'll be discussing those challenges tonight and looking at the possible policy frameworks that are under discussion and under debate in our country. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I am going to turn over the podium to our co-sponsor. We're very delighted tonight to join in partnership with the American Jewish Committee in putting together this program. I must give them credit. They said that we need to have more town halls on this subject, and I agreed with them. And so we've put together a program which we hope will be the first of several programs on this topic geared towards the public. So I'm going to turn the mic over briefly to David Kahn, who serves on the AJC's Executive Committee and chairs the Domestic Affairs Committee that initiates programs like this, also on the subject of the separation of church and state, public education, of course, tonight's program on energy policy. David?
I'm the person that no one wants to hear tonight, so I'll be very brief. On behalf of the American Jewish Committee and our Houston chapter, I'd like to join Amy and the Baker Institute in welcoming you all. For many years, AJC has been pressing for national policy to reduce dependence on oil. In addition to the energy security issues, dependence on oil impacts national security, international peace, and of course environmental, economic, and other issues that are of concern to every American and everyone around the world today. The issue clearly has many, many facets. I think that at least we can be optimistic. But we have to look hard, and we're going to need some new solutions, new ways of looking at the issues in order to come to some good progress for ourselves and for our children. I guess part of that optimism, our nation is poised for significant change. I think pretty much the entire political spectrum recognizes we need to do more, we need to do different. Here in Houston and in Texas, because of the way the role that energy plays in our economy, the issues may have some extra resonance, certainly extra importance for our chapter. And so we also have these very special resources in Houston, and we started with Amy Jaffe, who really runs probably the premier energy program here in the United States, and it's right here in Houston. And what we did from AJC, we had to do a whole lot of work. We had to decide, all right, we're going to call Amy Jaffe and figure out what we should do for a program, and we're really extraordinarily pleased to have, in addition to Amy, Richard Sears from Shell, Vice President for Exploration and Deep Water Technical Evaluation, Gal Luft, who's the Executive Director of the Institute for the Analysis of Global Security, Terry Hallmark of IHS, he's the Director of Political Risk and Policy Assessment. There's a lot of additional detail in your program, but just the titles alone will give you a sense of the great range of dimensions in this issue that we need to address. And so, as I said, nobody really wants to hear from me, so I'm going to stop talking and start listening and learn what we can about reducing dependence on oil and overcoming obstacles to success. Thank you.
So our format this evening is I'm going to give you the sort of broad brush overview to set the stage for tonight's discussion. And then I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give their opening statement to sort of raise what they think are some of the important issues. We've asked each of them to take a particular angle so that we will have a little less overlap and provide you with some interesting starting points. And then we'd like to, have a discussion with you, hear your questions and your ideas, and we'll all react to that. So let me begin talking a little bit about where we are, and I'm going to be a little statistical, so you have to excuse me for that. But when people talk about energy independence and some of these other topics, I feel that it's because people have moved away from the statistical. In other words, we're not understanding the scale and the numbers of the issue and how we would address them. And that until we really think about the numbers themselves and what we're trying to do in terms of the scale of what we need to do, it's hard for people to then think about the numbers of the policy options that are being debated in the country. So just to start us out, we are now currently using 21 million barrels a day in the United States. To give you an idea of why focusing only on the rising demand of China, that's not accurate, because in the entire global world we're only using about 80 to 82 million barrels a day of oil, and so the United States is using 25% or so of what's needed globally. Just to give you an idea, if you want to think about that on a per capita basis, and I hope I get these numbers right because I don't have my slides tonight, the average per capita would take all the energy being used, and I was to convert it to a BTU basis. That's sort of a general energy measure that we think of more for electricity, but anyway, BTU basis, we are using something like 335 million BTUs per capita. If you compare that same measure for China, it's 33. And if you compare it to India, we're talking about 11 to 13. So if you think about just in scale about how much, each of us divided by the population of the United States is using, we're using a tremendous amount of more energy than the populations of other countries. And then when you think about the sort of global future, and you imagine, as I can, because last year the last couple of years we've made several trips as the Institute to China, and I've stood in line in Shanghai and Beijing for a Starbucks, and used the hairdryer in the hotel and all the kinds of things that are going to happen in China that we're doing today, and you see the traffic in Chinese cities and the aspirations that people have to live exactly how we do. You can understand that you're talking about a lot of energy. I mean, a tremendous amount of energy for everybody in the world to live the way we do. And then you have to look at the flip side issue, which is that a third of the world's planet is living in abject poverty with absolutely no access to energy whatsoever. There's no electricity. There's no fuel. Women and children spend 18 hours a day collecting sticks and other kinds of traditional biomass to burn at night for heat and light and cooking. And so when you think about it, people tend to say, and not to say it's not, that gasoline is this miracle product and how incredibly efficient it is compared to other technologies. And OPEC talks about bringing oil on and how successful they have been to meeting world demand. When you think about the fact that a third of the world's population is not participating in this system of modern electricity, it doesn't seem like such a successful system anymore. So in the past, up until recent years, U.S. energy policy has actually been very simple. We have good allies. We count on them to bring more and more oil production online, and it'll be available, and miraculously we will consume it. And if there's a war that disrupts the supply of oil, say Iraq invades Kuwait, We can count on our good allies in Saudi Arabia and Venezuela and other places to increase the amount of oil they can bring on quickly because they have giant oil fields. And you know what? For 30 years it worked. For 30 years it worked, except for the little blip with the Iranian Revolution in '79. I mean, it basically worked. And so we didn't really think seriously about what kind of policies we wanted to have long term because it really didn't seem like we needed to. We just got up in the morning and it was there. We didn't think about it. But when we think about the amount of oil that we're going to need, hence my story about my trips to China, then it seems a little concerning. Because for us to have even the kind of prices we have today and the kind of supply balance, in other words, the amount of oil that's available compared to how much we want, that we have today, we're talking about OPEC being able to produce somewhere between 40 and 50 million barrels a day. Now you say, well, you know, how hard is that? They're already to 32 or 31, wherever they are today. And I say, well, okay, so you're telling me in 25 years we're going to want, you know, 50 or 75% more oil from OPEC. Let's talk about the history of OPEC. 30 years ago, what could OPEC produce? 30 years ago, OPEC could produce 38 or 39 million barrels a day, in other words, more than today. So over the last 30 years, OPEC's ability to produce more oil has not materialized. Actually, we've gone in the opposite direction. OPEC can produce less oil today than it could 30 years ago. And yet, when we think about the political stability of countries like Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, these countries are less stable today than they were 20 and 30 years ago. And so to just blithely assume, because somebody put it on a Department of Energy forecast, that because we need the oil, OPEC will get to 50 and produce it. This is a pretty risky proposition to base the economy and the well-being of our country and then, of course, the economy and well-being of all the other countries of the world. It's not a very realistic assumption. Now, not even talking about the geopolitical factors that might block OPEC from bringing on that oil, if I toss into the mix my concerns about the global climate, then the challenges become even greater. So we know in the science community people have talked about stabilizing carbon emissions in the atmosphere by 2050. And the numbers have moved around as to what the community thinks we need to stabilize carbon at. But if I took the most liberal of applications, the community would say, absolutely, we don't want to be higher than 550 ppm when we get to 2050. Some scientists are saying 450. Some people say, really, truly, we need to stabilize at 350. But I just did the math for you. Actually, I had the science guys do the math for you. Based on 550. That means that we would need to stabilize at 550, we would need to come up with 15 terawatts of non-fossil energy between now and 2050. So I can't think in terawatts. I have trouble thinking in terawatts. I'm sure all of you do too, so I made them work that out for me in something I could focus on. So I had them tell me what that is in oil, because remember, I'm telling you we're using 21 million barrels a day of oil, the world's using 80, and that OPEC could produce something like 50, but I don't think they'll get there. That would be 200 million barrels a day of oil. That's what we're talking about taking out of the energy system. So you hear a lot of people talk about how we're going to do it with nuclear energy. So I had them work out for me what the math was if we were going to do the whole thing by nuclear energy. Now remember, I'm exaggerating because of course we can use a variety of technologies. But again, just so you understand the scale of the issue, if we were going to do it with nuclear energy, we would need 20 times the number of plants that produce nuclear energy today on the globe. So again, to make that a U.S. number, this is a little inaccurate, but still gives you sort of an idea of the scale of what I'm talking about. In the United States, we have 103 nuclear plants operating today, producing a great amount of electricity for the United States. If we were going to need 20 times that, you're talking about building 2,000 nuclear power stations, new nuclear power stations in the United States between now and 2050. And so when you think about that, you understand the magnitude of the challenge we face to move to a higher proportion of non-fossil energy. Not only because maybe OPEC is not going to be able to produce the kind of oil we need, but also because perhaps we want to move a certain segment of our energy use to non-carbon fuels, the fuels that are lower in carbon. And so I bring this to the table so that you can understand the stage setting, so that now the panel can talk to you a little bit more specifically about the kinds of options that are being debated, why those options are being debated. There we've got three of the best minds in the industry in terms of Shell is one of the leading companies in terms of bringing energy solutions. Luft is one of the only sane voices in Washington, D.C., talking about policy, and Terry is the man who the industry consults every minute of every day about what kind of geopolitical risks the industry faces in all the places it is trying to go to invest in more energy supply. So we couldn't have a better panel tonight to discuss these kinds of issues with you, and I hope you'll all participate actively in asking questions, even non-technical questions, because even though we're all going to throw around some phrases, and I'm going to chastise the panel if they're using acronyms without telling you what it means, but we really want your active participation tonight. So with that, I'm going to ask Richard to be our first presenter.
Okay, thanks, Amy. That makes it very easy because I don't have to, like the others, they're going to have to scramble and figure out what hasn't been said yet, and I have it easier. I'm going to do a few things, and I'll save most of the numbers for questions because I got lots of numbers in my head. I can easily fall back on those. But I'm going to get through a couple of ideas, and then we'll move on and hopefully save lots of time for questions. I want to talk about the nature of the problem. I do want to come back to scale. Amy talked about it, and I'm going to drop a few numbers on you for scale, and I think they're numbers that you can relate to. And then a bit about the complexity of the problem, and then finally Shell as a company, how we look at it, what we're doing as a company. And then if you want more details, we can do that after in questions. First, scale is very important. Scale matters. The system matters. How you define the energy system matters a lot. You can find very complex problems can have very easy solutions if you boil the problem down to just a little piece. But you've only solved that one little piece, and you don't know what you've done outside that little piece. If you really want to solve problems, you have to consider the system. And so the system matters as much as scale matters. And a very important part of scale and system is time. Things happen over time, things take time, and we can't forget that. Real solutions, and I speak for Shell, I speak for me as a scientist of sorts, real solutions in my mind are things that are consistent with scale and system and realistic timeframes. You're not going to find real solutions that fix this energy problem, whatever this energy problem is, fix it tomorrow or next week or next year. It took us a long time to get here. It's going to take us a long time to get out. Oil is the backbone of our energy system right now. Oil and natural gas are 60–65% of primary energy supply around the world. There's a good reason for that. Mother Nature has provided us with these really neat little molecules that pack a lot of energy. Right? Oil and the products we make from oil, the liquid fuels we get from oil, gasoline and diesel, are far and away the most dense in terms of energy per unit volume, energy per unit weight. So they really are magical, wonderful fuels. We don't just use them because they happen to be there. They really are the best fuels around, and we're trying to replace huge volumes of the best fuels around. Amy talked about a few numbers. I want to put one in terms that I can relate to better. She talked about 2,000 nuclear power plants by 2050. That's one a week. This week, next week, and every week between now and 2050. That's a new nuclear power plant, not just licensed and designed, but built and operating. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. Come back to oil and natural gas, 80+ million barrels a day. Most people don't really talk a lot in barrels. We do in the business because we've gotten used to it. A barrel is 42 gallons. So let me turn 80 million barrels a day into something that you probably can relate to, a gallon. Okay? You know what a gallon gas can looks like. The world goes through 42,000 gallons of oil, produced, transported, refined, and used every second. Every second, 42,000 gallons. The world goes through every second 3 million cubic feet of natural gas, produced, transported, burnt probably in a power plant or somebody's gas fireplace. Right? These are real numbers. 3 million cubic feet of natural gas a second, 42,000 gallons of oil a second. And so when we talk about scale, when we talk about evolving the world's energy systems, we're talking about something that is going to replace those kinds of volumes, is going to make a difference when that's the sort of energy that the world uses. When we talk about energy security, it goes hand in hand, as Amy said, with economics. You're going to ask companies to do this, and companies are going to expect to make a profit somehow doing it. And you're going to ask them to do it in an environmentally responsible way. And so you ought to talk about security, you ought to talk about economics, you ought to talk about environment. Typically, when we talk about energy, we'll use a few simpler words, and most people want their energy to be cheap, convenient, and clean. Those are the everyday euphemisms for energy security, economics, and environment. I don't want to pay a lot. I want it to be in my backyard, but not produced from my backyard, because I don't want that quite that convenient, but mostly. And I want it to be clean. I don't want it to mess up the environment. And that's tough. Back to the scale of the problem, and trying to get something cheap, convenient, and clean at that scale is just plain difficult. It's not impossible. So what Shell does, and what Shell is doing, is we've been in business 100 years as mostly an oil company. And in that, we move a lot of oil and gas around the world. We say, and most people in the industry believe, that the age of easy oil is pretty much past us. The simple, easy to find, easy to define reservoirs are not totally in our past. We're still producing a lot of oil from them, but that's an era of the industry that is moving to the past. Now, it doesn't mean we're running out of oil. There are a lot of hydrocarbon molecules out there, an awful lot of hydrocarbon molecules. Even conventional oil, there's a lot of conventional oil out there. Proved reserves in fields today, 30 years supply, maybe another 30 years supply in fields we haven't discovered yet. There's a lot out there to be found, and then you add the tar sands and the oil shales and the odd type gas reservoirs and hydrates and other things. There's a lot of hydrocarbon molecules out there. The problem is, are they cheap, clean, and convenient? And that's what it comes down to. So we look at how to exploit these molecules, how to bring energy to the world. We look at it in an environment which is becoming more and more concerned about carbon and operating sensibly in a carbon-constrained world. Amy talked a little bit about CO2. Let's just make it up. If we were to try to stabilize the atmosphere at 550 parts per million CO2, which is a little bit more than it is today, that means that by 2050 we are, and if we're going to do that, again, just make it up, we're going to do that by taking that carbon dioxide and sequestering it into the earth, turning it into a supercritical liquid and injecting it into the earth. And we could debate whether that's possible or not. Just pretend that's what we're going to do. In 2050 or so, we are injecting as much supercritical liquid carbon dioxide into the earth as we are producing today oil from the earth, about 100 million barrels a day. So this is not a simple problem. We're back to scale. If you want to stabilize the CO2 in the atmosphere, you have to do a lot with a lot of molecules of carbon dioxide. So again, the solutions are not going to be simple. So, but we try. We struggle with this. We look at conventional. We look at the unconventional and how to do tar sands and oil shales in an environmentally sustainable and sensible fashion. And we look at renewables. We spend a lot of money, several $100 million a year, I'll say, in renewable energies, in wind, in solar, primarily. We play around with hydrogen a little bit, not to try to transform the world's energy systems into hydrogen, but hydrogen as a niche energy carrier is a reasonable choice. In Iceland, for example, There are cities in Iceland where the hydrogen is made by operating geothermal plants, and it's not by reforming natural gas. So we work on renewables, we work on conventional, we work on unconventional, and there's a simple reason we do a lot of this stuff is because we know that the answers aren't simple. We know that we can't predict how it will all play out, and so in our business today, we feel we have to be poking around in a lot of different things, trying to find the solutions, and hopefully be there and maybe be a part of it going forward. So I'll leave it at that, and we can get into more details with questions and answers.
Thank you. Good to be here with the American Jewish Committee, who happens to be, along with my institute, a member of the Set America Free Coalition. And there is a Rice connection, is because one of the founders of the coalition, it's a coalition of Green and Hawks and scientists and labor and all kinds of strange bedfellows, but one of the founders of the coalition was Professor Rick Smalley. Some of you probably know he passed away recently, and he was one of the best minds in the business, and he got a Nobel Prize for some of the most interesting technologies that can get us to a new energy regime. So I'm glad to be here. I also want to offer you a number, not as big as the numbers that you and Amy mentioned here, and my number is 16.8. What is 16.8? It's the life cycle of the average American car. In other words, when you put a car on the road today, it will be on the road for 16.8 years. Now, if you have a high-paying job in the oil industry, you're probably not going to keep it for 16.8 years. You're probably going to sell it to someone who will continue to drive it for the duration of the life cycle of the car. Now, what does it mean? It means that if we continue to put cars on the road, and the cars that we put on the road today can only run on gasoline or diesel and petroleum products, and we're putting about 14 million of them on the road every year. If we continue to put those cars on the road, that means that we are locking ourselves to petroleum for the next 16.8 years. So let's ask ourselves, what will be the petroleum system like for the next 17 years? And is it something that will allow us to live the way we live today with the American way of life that is so dependent on the automobile and the architecture of our cities, et cetera, et cetera? So what is the future of petroleum for the next 17 years? Well, I just want to cite here a study, a survey that came out today by KPMG. And they surveyed 535 oil and gas executives. That came out today. 82% of them said that they're very worried about the problem of declining reserves, and 60% said that the trend of declining reserves is irreversible. So that shows that even within the industry, and I'm not part of the industry, but even within the industry there are concerns. And I'm not even talking about the fact that China is growing and the fact that there is a terrible problem of investment or lack of investment in new production capacity in the very same country that's supposed to bring new oil and gas into the market. You know, you look at all the countries that are the leaders and they're all in decline. Venezuela is going down, Iran is going down, Iraq. Remember the 6 or 7 million barrels a day that Iraq was supposed to produce? They are at 1.7 today. So these are not looking good. And I'm not even talking about the fact that just 2 weeks ago we had 172 terrorists arrested in Saudi Arabia, and some of them went through flight training. They were practicing to fly planes into oil facilities in Saudi Arabia and blow up and cause a major economic disruption. So these are not good signs for the future. And yet, you know, Amy asked me to address the question, why is it, if everybody understands it, you come here to this forum and you read and you're worried and you're concerned, why is it that we keep on putting cars that can only run on gasoline, and our energy policy is shameful? I mean, you just last week, Senate marked up, an energy committee marked up an energy bill, what should be the flagship of this session, And if you look at this energy bill, it's a disgraceful bill. It bill, for example, that tells you that it has a gasoline saving requirement that looks on its face very good, but all it basically does is shift from gasoline to diesel fuel. So we shift from one petroleum fuel to another, keeping this huge loophole in the system. Just like someone who's obese, you tell him, okay, you move from vanilla ice cream to chocolate ice cream. It's not going to make any difference, and yet the bill passed the way it is, and we don't see that politicians are really taking this issue very seriously, despite the fact that every single one of them, every single presidential candidate has this wonderful, flary speech about the need to increase our energy security and become energy independent and blah, blah, blah. But when you look really what's happening on the ground, when you look at the legislative initiatives, when you look at what actually happens, it's not very impressive. So why is it? Why is it that there is a huge gap between the scope of the problem and the level of anxiety and worry in the public and the results on the ground? So first observation I have is that I think most people don't realize that we're talking about two different issues here. And sometimes we get to mix two separate problems. When we talk about energy, we need to remember there are two forms of energy. One is this energy, the light, the air condition. This is electricity, all right? Electricity made from coal, nuclear, solar, hydropower, natural gas, but not oil. We no longer produce electricity from oil in this country, unless we live in Long Island. But we used to in the 70s, but we no longer do. That's why when Jimmy Carter said, wear a sweater and save oil, that made a lot of sense then. But since then, we really weaned the power sector from oil. The other form of energy, on the other hand, is all about oil. It's transportation. What brought you here. What brings you food from the farm to the plate. What brings the gift that you bought for Mother's Day from China to our shop. And this form of energy is all about petroleum. 97% of the transportation energy that we're using is petroleum. Now, the problem is that the solutions to the petroleum problem are not always the solution to the electricity problem, and vice versa. And I think the public is very confused. And a lot of the confusion is created by a very successful campaign by the environmentalist movement in this country to confuse the public. So how many times you see soldiers fighting in Iraq for oil, and then they're telling you that instead of fighting for oil in the Midwest, all we have to do is build a few wind turbines in Kansas, or I don't know. So as I said, wind turbines are not going to solve your oil problem unless you begin to use electricity as a fuel, which is a very good idea, but we're not doing it now. So the reason that the environmentalist movement have pushed so hard on this, because for them, the problem is not oil. The problem is not the geopolitics. The problem is fossils. That's the big nemesis, the fossil fuels in general. If you look at it from a geopolitical standpoint, if you're concerned about terrorism, if you're concerned about the fact that 74% of the world's oil reserves are in Muslim countries at a time that our relations with the Muslim world are not that great, then your problem is not so much coal or natural gas, maybe natural gas a little bit, but mainly oil. So I'm just saying it because we have a problem in a sort of energy 101, and we really need to sort of understand the building blocks, what affects what is the problem, what is the solution, what solves what. The other issue that I feel very strongly that really, I mean, there is a huge gap between what people say that they care about and what they're actually willing to do about it. We ran a study, and there have been a number of polls actually on this issue that ask people, are you worried about global warming? Yeah. Are you worried about oil dependence? Oh, yeah, my God, it's a huge issue. And then you ask people, what are you willing to do about it? So by far, for example, 95% of the people said that they're extremely worried about oil dependence. And then they had to rank the policies that they would like to see the government implementing. So by far, 90% of the people said the most popular policy to reduce oil dependence was to build more solar panels and wind turbines. And I told you, it has nothing to do with the problem. Now, what was the most unpopular policy? Gasoline tax. Nobody wants gasoline tax. Now, arguably, I think that most people would agree that the best way to reduce demand is to pay more, to send a price signal. And yet the public is not willing to entertain it. And by the way, similar thing is happening with global warming. You get people so anxious and worried about global warming, but when you ask them, what are you really willing to do to solve this problem? And I always tell people, you know, are you worried about global warming? Let me tell you 3 things that you can do to reduce. I don't believe that we can solve this problem, but at least mitigate the problem. Number 1, move from your mansion to a small apartment, because 60% of our electricity is used for heating and cooling. So that's a good way to reduce your space. Number 2, move from sell your big SUV and either take a subway or walk or drive a tiny car. Number 3, become vegetarian, because 18% of our greenhouse gases are manufactured by livestock. Now, if you're not willing to do all 3, or 1 of the 3, or 2 out of the 3, don't tell me that you're worried about global warming. Or you may be worried, but you're not going to affect global warming, because what I'm saying is, you know, it's not enough to go and change your light bulb. It's not going to make any difference. And the real inconvenient truth is that any of these problems will only be addressed through some sort of sacrifice. It's not that a bunch of people in Washington will wave a magic wand and the problem will go away. It is, you know, we are the problem. I'm sorry to say it, but we are the problem. And I don't necessarily see it as a problem. What I'm saying, if you believe that there is a problem, then look at yourself in the mirror first. And that does not mean that Washington does not have a role to play here. It does. It does, and unfortunately, Washington is not doing what it should be doing to reduce or address these problems. People, for example, in Washington have this tendency to introduce bills because they want to say, I have a bill. Like Martin Luther King, I have a dream, I have a bill. It doesn't matter if the bill has 1 sponsor or 2 co-sponsors, it's not going to go anywhere. But the fact of the matter, you can go to a town hall meeting. If you were, you know, Barack Obama is the senator that introduced more bills than anybody else. But if you look at how many sponsors or co-sponsors most of the bills have, it's Barack and Obama. So, you know, it's not enough to say, I have a bill. You really need to have, and by the way, you probably know that in Washington, it's not even enough that the Senate passes a bill. You need the bill to pass also in the House. And most time what happens, Senate passes a bill and it gets killed in the House and vice versa. A bill is only good once it's on the president's desk and the president takes a pen and signs it into a law. Otherwise, it's just a piece of paper. And there are thousands of bills, thousands of, and hundreds of energy bills out there. But they don't amount to anything because everybody has an ego and everybody wants to show that he is the leader. And they never come together. They never come together as a group to formulate a policy that can really move forward. Now, I started with 16.8 years. I think that the lowest hanging fruit is to make sure that we really begin to create a situation in which we have a fuel choice in this country. We really need to have a situation that more and more cars can run on something other than gasoline. And they can run on gasoline too, but we need to have the option to run them on something other than gasoline. Just like our electricity sector is diversified, we need to diversify the transportation sector. And that can be done with alcohols, it can be done with ethers, it can be done with electricity, it can be done with other non-transportation applications. You know, I don't know how many of you can work from home. It's one way to, you know, if you work from home, if all you do in life is sit in front of a computer and a phone for 8 hours, maybe you don't need to go to work. Maybe you can do the work from your basement, and then who cares what you drive and what fuel you're using. So there are many things that can be done, but by the end of the day, we need Washington to send the right price signals. We need Washington to send the right incentives for these kind of technologies. And we can talk more about the technology-specific solutions in the discussion, but I think that it's up to us to tell our politicians that we care about it, to understand that we have a role to play, that we are going to be shouldering some of the burden here, and also to sort of be less ambitious in our expectation. We are stuck with oil, coal, natural gas, and the fossil fuels for many years to come. And I agree with the previous speakers about the scope of the problem. But at the same time, I think we need to understand that to instill a sense of urgency and realize that whatever we decide to do, transition period is very long. And we might as well start it today rather than wait another 20 years before we count at 16.8 years. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to be here this evening. I'm going to talk about energy security. And when Amy gave the introduction, she was quite right to suggest that once upon a time energy security was a fairly simple thing. It just had to do with the availability of sufficient supplies at affordable prices. But now, today, I think the one thing you can say about energy security is that it's so much more complicated than it once was. Before, it used to just focus on oil. Now it's something different. The paradigm that has been in effect really for the last 3 decades or so really doesn't hold. Energy security doesn't stand alone in isolation as it once did, and the way to think about it is to understand that it's literally, energy security is literally wedged between and amongst nations and how they relate to one another, and then in terms of our purposes here, more importantly, how the United States relates to them. Past that, the discussion also includes some other things that we didn't used to think much about. Natural gas, LNG, alternative fuel sources, pipelines, refineries, the downstream sector, and so forth. So in short, the energy security landscape has changed. And there's a handful of factors that I've found interesting in over the last couple of years that have emerged that have shaped the way it's changed. One of the first and most obvious is the emergence and changing role of national oil companies, acting primarily as exploration companies. The Baker Institute did a report here in March of this year rather, that noted that these national oil companies now control a little less than 80% of the world's reserves. I think the precise number is 77%. The point, and what's important here, is that these national oil companies are creations and instruments of sovereign states, which means that they're overtly political. And at a bare minimum, if they've done nothing else, they've increased the level of competition for exploration opportunities, reserve additions, and the like. What makes these national oil companies of further interest is that they are, while they may be acting like exploration companies, they're not necessarily responsible to shareholders like international oil companies. They're not necessarily interested in the bottom line like traditional exploration companies. And so they're competitors to our oil companies and to other oil companies abroad. That's problematic at a certain level because they can sometimes engage in national oil company to national oil company agreements and arrangements that are outside the scope of regular contracts or contain elements or provisions that are unusual and bring things into the fold or the discussion in terms of doing business that traditional oil companies can't. That's all to say that there's a bit of an unlevel playing field emerging sometimes with these national oil companies. One of the other things that these national oil companies have done is they've driven a new level of cooperation and interaction between countries that haven't existed before. This is especially true when countries share a certain worldview or a political ideology or common political or energy security goals. Countries and governments have been forming alliances for a long time. This in and of itself is nothing new. But what's striking about these new relationships is that they transcend the usual ties between producers and consumers and so forth. Because what's going on is these new geopolitical linkages are part of a broader foreign policy that's aimed at securing certain geopolitical or geostrategic ends that are in some cases completely separate and apart from oil markets or market fundamentals. And in some of these instances, in the case of, say, arrangements that have been secured and done between, say, Iran and Venezuela, they've been contrary to our national interest. A third factor that's not new, but has changed is, of course, terrorism. What's interesting now about terrorism and terrorist groups, a lot of these groups have unrecognizable centers of gravity. They're very innovative in terms of their organizational structures, and their leadership structures are very flexible, and they're armed with all the same kinds of modern technologies and communication devices that we all have, and so that they can operate in a way that's different than before. There's also evidence that they're beginning to understand that they can coordinate bombings and attacks and things like that to heighten the market anxiety and to maximize the effect that shut-in production would have on crude prices and the like. One might argue that these attacks will become more frequent coming down the road because other targets like transportation facilities or government buildings or whatnot have become better protected. Gal just mentioned a minute ago the attack that was started recently in Saudi Arabia, and of course there was also the potential attack on Abqaiq in 2006 in Saudi Arabia, the large Saudi oil complex there. Not only then are targets here at risk, but I think the point is that when you look out across the broad landscape of the things that terrorists can hit and what it can mean for oil markets, the world economy, United States economy, you get some feel for the fact that things are rather more sensitive than they once were. These attacks are no longer just isolated events where single pipelines are bombed or there's an odd occasional kidnapping or something like that. Also noteworthy but not new is the return of resource nationalism. There's been a lot of talk about the emergence of a number of left-wing politicians in Latin America. We've seen nationalizations in Venezuela and in Bolivia. And then, of course, there's been a concerted effort on the part of Vladimir Putin and his administration to reassert control over the Russian oil and gas industry. So that's something, too, that we've seen before, but it's new and different because, say, 10 or 15 years ago, I had quit talking about nationalizations. I didn't think that there was any possibility that another one would occur. Everyone had pretty much decided that free market economics was the way to go, and so we've seen this come back into the fore in recent years, and it's made things more difficult. Then if you just think about the simple problems on our hands, I mean, the fact that many of the oil-producing countries are plagued with all kinds of political problems and political violence. I mean, there's the war in Iraq, what might happen in Iran, the Niger Delta in Nigeria, and the emergence of the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta, which has been particularly effective at taking production offline and shutting in production. The emergence of Al-Qaeda across northern Africa and Algeria and Morocco and Tunisia. That's something that's rather new. And then, of course, there's Saudi Arabia, radical Islam, Wahhabism. And that says nothing about taking into account emerging consumers, primarily in the Far East, with India and China. There's countries where we may not have any particular oil interest, but could cause us problems in other parts of the world. I'm thinking here about what might it mean just in general in terms of our foreign policy, but probably down the road in some fashion our energy security. If there's a change in leadership in Pakistan, or if there's a change of leadership in, say, Egypt. Those are all things that apply pressure to us in terms of our energy security. There's a whole lot of things that one could talk about. But the point, and I've been very brief, is to just say, look, that there are all these things out there. Things seem more interconnected than they've ever been. We find ourselves in a situation where we are particularly and acutely concerned about energy security, and all of these things that I've just talked about are largely outside our control because they are outside our borders, and we find ourselves with not much of an opportunity to do anything about them. And so I don't know what that says in terms of how we move down the road, but it seems to me that there's only a minimal number of things that we can do, perhaps a better diplomacy or something like that. But it's to just say that this is a very difficult situation, and if we find ourselves in this spot, and then as Gala suggested, the development of new sources is going to take a very long time, it might lead one to the conclusion that we're in a pretty tight spot. Clients will ask me, or maybe when I teach at the University of Houston, well, what would happen if the Strait of Hormuz was closed? Or what would happen if, Nigerian production was shut off for a particularly long period of time? Or what would it mean if, say, for example, the Russians cut off gas to Europe? And I think maybe the bigger question might be, what would happen if any one, two, or three of those things happened simultaneously? And what would it mean? And so this is what I've been thinking about in terms of energy security. And with that, I'll stop.
Okay, I hope everybody's really worried now.
Well,
And you can ask the panel a question about solutions or comments. Just get us started.
All of you imply that conservation is a way to buy more time, reduce our dependence on foreign oil. All of you imply that market forces are the key to that, and yet the American public doesn't want to vote for higher gas taxes. Would the American public, Mr. Luft, vote for higher gas taxes if in return they got dramatically reduced income taxes, or at least income taxes, there was income tax relief for the lower income levels so that only the rich were paying both gas taxes and income taxes?
There is a study, there was a poll done by the New York Times asking the exact same question, and the public doesn't have much trust in that the government will be able to. They believe that they will pay the tax, but nothing will happen on the other side of the equation. So the taxation is not a very popular policy, as you know, and every politician that wants to stay in power is staying away from this. People like Tom Friedman or others that don't run for election can write about it day and night, but it's not something that is in our very pervasive in our political system. And by the way, one of the things that is happening to me that always when we look at gasoline prices all over the world, you go to Europe or Japan, they pay for a liter what we pay for a gallon. So what they do is they take the cheap oil that we are subsidizing through the defense of the Persian Gulf. And in a non-war area, we pay about anywhere between $50 and $60 billion. just to keep our military capabilities intact. So in essence, we are subsidizing cheap oil for the rest of the world for lots and lots of free riders. They take the cheap oil we are subsidizing and taxing their people so they can maintain all kind of failed social policies. And I think that we need to begin to talk to those countries about how do we share the burden here. You know, it's not only the United States that uses oil. I haven't seen a Japanese aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf for a very, very long time. So you know, we may want to talk to our allies. Maybe they have a role to play here as well.
This is Denny. How many of the politicians really understand the energy industry? I certainly know the public doesn't understand it. You know, they talk about ethanol, and ethanol is a marginal solution as I understand it. They don't really talk about the important issues. You know, they talk about taxing the super majors, and I think, as Terry said, you're now competing with the national oil companies for opportunities. Do the politicians really understand the issues?
Sometimes people ask me, what is the single most important thing we need to do to improve our energy security? I always say, take the primaries out of Iowa. Because what happens is, you want to be the next president of the United States, you go to Iowa, the first thing you get off the plane, they ask you, Mr. Senator, Mr. Governor, where do you stand on ethanol subsidies? Where do you stand on import tariff, on 54-cent tariff on imported? You know, we actually pay tariff if we import ethanol from a friendly country like Brazil. And we don't pay tax on imported oil, but we pay tax on imported alternative fuel. That's only in America. So I mean, the politics, the political component is way, way above what you even begin to imagine. I'll give you an example from the recent scandalous energy bill that was just passed last week. You would think that if you want to move from oil to alternatives, you want to open the door wide and let as many alternative fuels to compete, right? That would be the sensible thing to do. So you want to say, okay, if you're an alternative fuel approved by the Department of Energy, welcome aboard. Let's play. If you can make it cheap, if you can compete with gasoline, why not? So what they did in this energy bill, they just limited the definition of alternative fuel. So pretty much only ethanol now is an alternative fuel, and biodiesel. But now why is it? Because you have an ethanol industry in the United States that, in the name of energy security and energy independence, and they come across as the biggest advocates for energy independence, but they are the biggest obstacle for the deployment of alternative fuels in the United States. They want only ethanol and only from corn. And they are a very bad bunch of people who only think about how to squeeze the government for more and more subsidies. And I think we need to begin to call them up for this. But again, because we have a political system in which those special interest groups are very powerful, and if you're a politician, you see your voters every 6 years, or if you're a senator, but you see the lobbyists every other day, of course, they will have a lot of impact. And I think one of our biggest problems is we don't have anybody who represents the American people on energy issues on Capitol Hill. Now you asked you framed the question. I forgot how you about the how much do they understand on. Not only that they don't understand energy, they don't understand science, which is a huge problem. I can count on one hand how many of the 535 people that we sent to Washington have a scientific education. You go to China, it's very interesting. Most of the politicians in China are scientists. In our country, they're all lawyers. Lawyers know how to sue each other, and they know how to legislate maybe. But the problem that our politicians don't have good scientific background is a huge impediment, because it allows all kind of people, all kind of funny ideas that are not based on science or on reality, to sell all kind of big ideas that have no merit in Washington, and spend billions of dollars of wasted taxpayers' money that doesn't get us anywhere, and it's a huge problem.
Hi. So building on the last question, there are a couple of technologies that are emerging here that are not yet affordable to the average consumer. The new hybrid cars, for instance, are not readily affordable to the average consumer. The ethanol, the way that's going to end up playing out is that our food is just going to get much more expensive, and then everything will have to, people will start looking for a solution. How do we incentivize the new technologies for transportation, either natural gas or alternative alcohol energy, to actually start producing those cars, or making it worth the while of the car producers to start producing those cars within the next 18 years?
Flexible fuel cars, this very, very high-tech technology. The first flexible fuel car, if I remember correctly, was put on the road in 1906 by Henry Ford. It cost about $50 to $100 per car to make a car flex fuel. If, in Brazil, 87% of the cars this year sold will be flex fuel. So that's a no-brainer. So, and I think that flex fuel should be real flex fuel, not only ethanol. It should be warranted to run on all the alcohols. In other words, not only ethanol, methanol, butanol, and there are lots of others that can play a role in the market. And that's a completely ready and commercial and economic technology that can come into the marketplace. If you really want to do ethanol, then you need to move fast beyond corn, because corn is very limited, not a very good crop. You need to begin to produce much more of it from sugarcane, remove the tariff, allow free trade. Even that is not going to get you very far. You need to open the door to methanol, because that's an alcohol that can be made from coal, it can be made from natural gas, it can be made from flared gas, it can be made from anything that has carbon. You can gasify biomass. By the way, if you gasify biomass, 1 ton of biomass, you get almost twice as much energy than if you do methanol, if you do ethanol. So, and still, methanol is not playing a role in the market. Electricity and hybrid. I think that this is something that has a lot of potential. It's every new technology, you pay a premium when it starts. When I bought my first cell phone, it was that big, that heavy, and it cost me about 1 month's salary to get it. And now, so that we are going through this transformation, and the technology will probably become much cheaper. But once you get there, if you drive your car on electricity, if you have a plug-in hybrid car, you're driving on 75 cents per gallon equivalent. So the question is, how do you get people to pay the premium that allows them to get the car, and then basically the car pays for itself. And there are some issues with batteries. There's some. We're not ready yet for this. But when I look at the sort of wide array of technology that are popping in the horizon, this is the kind of technology I think will fit very well with the American way of life, because most people don't drive more than 20 miles per day. The average commute of the average American is 20 miles per day. So if you give people a 20-mile battery, that's good enough for most Americans to drive most of the time on electricity, and they still have the, if you have, the next time you have a hurricane in Houston and you want to run away, you don't have a range limitation. You still have a fuel tank, and you can go as far as you want.
I guess we're really interested in Washington's view. My question is, given the U.S. hasn't signed on to Kyoto, what is your comments regarding carbon emission markets?
I think it's a bad idea. So
should we have a market for carbon? Should we put a price on carbon and let companies buy and sell the value of being able to...
Well, no. Well, I think there are two issues here. People call it in Washington cap and trade. trade is fine. The problem is, where do you cap it? Because if you look at the European model, it was a complete failure. Now, why was it a failure? Because they didn't cap it in the right place. They did not want to hurt their economic growth, so they kept it they were very timid when they were capping. So then the price collapsed and nobody wanted to buy because the carbon had essentially no value. Now on Kyoto, I think, again, you want to have a multinational regime. I think that any multinational regime that keeps China and India out of the mix is not going to worth anything, because these are by far, in China, India, U.S., between us, there are 800 coal-fired power plants that are coming online in the next few years. So if we don't address the growth of China and India, everything that we do will cost us a lot of money. Will just end up us losing industry and jobs that will move to those countries. And that's why we did not want to sign on Kyoto. And by the way, that was not George Bush. 95 senators were opposed to it. Some of them were Democrats.
Richard, could you give us sort of an industry perspective on the whole cap and trade or carbon taxes?
Well, I can give you a bit of perspective on sort of this discussion. I mean, at least from one company that I know well, that I'm willing to talk about. There are others I kind of know well, but I'm not allowed to talk about them. Now, Shell's, these are sort of this complex world, and Shell, as a company, we're in a position we don't make policy. We're struggling trying to figure out how to invest $20 billion this year in various projects: exploration, production, refining, marketing, alternative fuels, including wind and solar. We're going to invest $20 billion plus this year in energy projects around the world, and we struggle sometimes to figure out in what environment are we investing that money. We're just trying to figure out the rules that exist so we can go play by them. And can we make a fair return in the United States, in China, in Nigeria, in Russia? The rules change all over. And by the way, they change in the U.S. too. It seems that no government's immune from that. So our problem is we don't make the rules. We just try to live with it. I know one thing. We don't do projects. We won't do energy projects that only work because government policy is subsidizing them. This is a Shell thing. Other companies may treat it differently, but if a project is only a sound economic project because there are some tax benefits, subsidies, special deal because it's a special fuel or special, we're just not going to do it because it's just not a sound business. It has to be underlying, has to be a fundamentally sound business, or we're not going to go into it. And that makes some of these problems a little difficult when we go compete. It makes it, now in one sense you say, well, gee, it's too bad. It's not a level playing field. So we go to Nigeria, for example, and it's not a level playing field because a Korean company is willing to offer the Nigerians, well, if you give us these onshore leases up in that basin, at onshore basin, we'll build a railroad to the major cities up there from Lagos. And yeah, that's an unfair landscape. Well, guess what? It's also unfair because a few commercial oil companies know that you will never make money if you have to build a railroad to that basin and extract the hydrocarbons that actually probably don't exist in that basin anyway. So who wins? I guess the Nigerians at the end, if they really do get their railroad. It's complicated, and as a company, we try to struggle to find a path through it so we can. I mean, we're not like all this altruistic, but we feel like we have a commitment to customers. I mean, something like 20 million people a day pull into Shell stations, and we'd like to have gas in the tanks so they can fuel. Now, if they start demanding something different, we'll start supplying something different, and we're struggling to find what those things are.
I missed the National Oil Company session a month or two ago, and I heard it was good. So maybe this is a naive question, but from a consumer perspective, I mean, does it matter whether a tyrant says, get out of here Shell, get out of here Chevron, get out of here ExxonMobil, get out of here BP? And, I mean, in a way, all they have to, I mean, technology is sort of rendering the big four sort of like just capital providers and project managers on one level. And they can go to Schlumberger, or they can go to Baker Hughes or the seismic guys and, you know, get all the constituent pieces and kind of do their own thing. And I mean, so from a consumer standpoint, you sit back and you say, well, we just care about getting something, and I don't have an axe to grind on major oil companies or independents or anything else, but when you brought up the specter of, well, you know, oh my gosh, you know, these national oil companies, I mean, from your perspective, it's probably an awful prospect because you're getting cut out on the action, which, you know, that's not a good thing unless there's the value you can bring. But from a consumer standpoint, a tyrant's not going to be in business as a tyrant unless he can, you know, provide the cash flow to keep whatever thing he's got going. And that means providing consumers with a reasonable, you know, cup of oil.
Let me summarize, because we spent 2 years on this issue. And we didn't know what we were going to find when we started out. We did actual historical case studies of 15 national oil companies, and then we had 3 or 4 economists from Rice work on measuring, you know, does it matter if it's Shell or one of these national oil companies? So we did it 2 ways, right? We looked at exactly what these national oil companies do on a day-to-day basis and how their businesses are run, and we looked at, you know, the numbers of what Shell takes out of the ground and how much money they make from it and how much they reinvest. And what we concluded actually is that it does matter. And the reason that it matters is that if what we found, and we looked across the globe, we didn't just look at what Hugo Chavez was doing, we looked at the companies like Statoil from Norway and Petronas, which is a very well-run company in Malaysia, and the range of companies. What we found was that almost without exception, for every dollar I bring in of my oil revenue, if I'm a national oil company, I have 8 or 9 other priorities of things I have to do with some of that money. And that might go from everything from, in Iran, making gasoline 10 cents a liter, right, because I'm redistributing the wealth back to my public, or in the case of Malaysia, bailing out the country from a depression in 1998 that looked like it was going to melt down the banking system, so I have to go out and give loans to the airline, state airline. I had to build a giant tower in Kuala Lumpur and a mall to revitalize the city of Kuala Lumpur and make people want to come there. And what that means to you, the consumer, is that whereas, you know, hopefully if Shell brings in $1, they're going to spend that dollar, at least they stop buying back their stock, the companies are going to spend that dollar, right, making sure that they have an asset to trade and sell in the future. But if I'm the government of Venezuela and I'm going to spend that money providing food aid to the poor in Venezuela, that's a good thing, except that's $7 billion that you're spending to do that. And to provide basic education is $7 billion you're not reinvesting in your fields. So we measured it. Now, I'm not saying, you know, we measured it, we work with statistics. I'm not saying it's right. You know, it's the computer and it's not exact. But what we found was that in the cases of countries, which is almost every single OPEC country, where they subsidize fuel to the public as a means of redistributing wealth or building the economy, that they operate at only 35% the technical efficiency. That's a economics term for, you know, how much do I get to share, to how much return do I get to my capital, than a private oil company. And in the case of the whole range of NOCs, you take every NOC in the world and every private company in the world, the NOCs are operating about 60%. So what that means is the IEA says we have to invest $2.2 trillion over the next 30 years to meet demand for oil. And if the people who are doing that are going to do it at 35% efficiency, and by the way, they're taking 30% of their budget and they're not going to spend it, reinvest it at all, what are the chances the oil to you, the consumer, is going to show up?
Okay, so let's take over the countries then. I'm ready to go.
You could be the next person.
Got it.
So here's my question, because I'm really impressed with the degree of consensus among the 4 of you. I know nothing about oil except what I've learned. And the degree of consensus in terms of the problems and in terms of some of the issues is much higher, I think, for the four of you than the rest of the country. Forget about the rest of the world where there's no consensus. And what I see as the biggest barrier to progress is the lack of trust. And I think the lack of trust is not a false lack of trust, it is a real lack of trust. So if we don't find a way to build trust, to deal with whether we should shift to cars that use multiple fuels, or whether we should increase taxes, or whether we should, or shift taxes, or whether we should change the way we subsidize drilling, or whether we should work directly on international relations, if we don't deal with the trust issues, what I'm fearing is we're going to be left with two solutions, if that's what it is, to the problem. One is we might get lucky and get a random technological innovation which will buy us time. Somebody figures out how to do fusion on a table with no hydrocarbon emissions. I mean, maybe it's going to happen. And the other alternative is we're going to have a disaster, because that's the only thing that really mobilizes the country to address problems. And then we don't know who's going to get gored. Somebody's going to get gored, but we will have a mobilization. What are we going to do? And I'm just sitting here thinking, what institutions do we have that will build trust? It's not technological skill in the senators that we need. We need to actually get people working together. The only model I can come up with, which is sort of local, is NASA, where in fact the country decided, because we were so scared of what the Russians were going to do after World War II, that we were going to have a space program, and actually that sort of worked, Anyway, that's my view. What do you all think? What are we going to do to get trust so that there can be some, let's assume there might be 3 solutions out there, that we find one of them?
I'll give you some examples that have nothing to do with science or solutions. They're purely structural. And I think that, as I said, a lot of the problems we're facing in Washington are structural, have to do with our political system. I was not joking when I said we need to get the primaries out of Iowa. It's not that the founding fathers said, "Thou shalt go to Iowa to become a president." You have a situation, for example, almost everybody in Washington, there's a critical mass now, including the president, by the way, who has finally opened up to the idea of increasing fuel efficiency standards in automobiles. And there's clearly enough votes for it, both in the House and I believe also in the Senate. I mean, the Senate Commerce Committee just passed a bill 10 by 10. But you have a guy, his name is John Dingell. Congressman, he's the oldest serving congressman. He's 80, in his 80s now. He represents Dearborn, Michigan. He is the chair of the Energy Committee in the House. And he's like the guy with a finger in the dike, As long as he's there, he's going to fight it. And, you have a lot of examples like this. Do you ever ask yourself, why is it the 2 people who head the Senate Energy Committee comes from New Mexico? What's in New Mexico that they're so... Well, they have national labs. National labs in New Mexico are the biggest employers. So these 2 guys, all they care about is how to bring money to New Mexico, so that people can sit and research for solutions that don't exist, which is nice. But, we are interested in solutions that do exist. We're interested in deploying things that... So I don't know about trust. I don't know how to build trust. I don't trust many people, so I'm not the person to talk about it. But I think that there are certain fixes that we need to do to our political system that will make those... why do we need to get those congressmen to run for re-election every 2 years? They're constantly after the money. Think about it. You just got elected. Next morning you have to fundraise for the next... So... And that's not only energy. I look at our health system, I look at many other problems we have in our society, and I see it's all sort of connecting. It's all connecting, and it all has to do with our, not all, but a lot of it has to do with some very, very flawed component of our political system that can be changed. Not easily, but can be changed. And And if we do that, it will be easier to implement all kind of other policies. But I'm very skeptical it will happen.
Let me just make an aside to this. Because we spend a lot of time at the Baker Institute doing what I call unofficial diplomacy. You know, we're traveling to other countries and we're going as academics and we're doing sort of second-level diplomacy. In other words, I'm meeting with the guy who sits in China and does what I do, write little policy papers for people in Chinese politics to read. And I have to tell you, when you mention this thing about us freaking out about the Russians and therefore we had a space program, I don't think the people in this country understand. I mean, part of the hopeful part is actually also the problem. If we don't do it, it doesn't mean that no one's going to do it. It means that somebody else is going to do it. If you want to go out today and buy a car that works and uses less gasoline, there's one car. I was just test driving hybrids. There's one car in the market, and that's it. It's Toyota. Because all the other cars don't really 100% work. When here you're in Houston, you stop and go traffic, the air conditioning goes off. Okay? So there's one company. And why does that company have that car? That company has that car because the Japanese government subsidized them, gave them tax breaks, and paid for the R&D. Right? They had a conscious policy. The Americans are not going to sign Kyoto. We're going to do this through our car industry. They made a conscious decision as a nation that they would create this technology and deploy it internationally. And what is that going to mean? You all listen to the radio. So while his senator sits blocking everything that could work in this country, the car companies he's supposedly protecting are going to flush down the toilet. Right? While other cars, little Chinese mini cars and Japanese hybrid cars take the entire market, and all of you in 16.8 years will be driving one of those cars. So this idea that somehow it won't happen, well, I don't really believe in that. It'll happen, but not in a country like ours if we don't get our act together. This is an export market opportunity. Right? It's an if those of you while I've been driving around trying to find a hybrid car, I've been listening to the audio tape of The World is Flat by Tom Friedman. You know, I mean the jobs are going to be exported. And that is what is going to bring it here.
We've heard a lot of discussion of the problems and everything. I would like to have each one of the panelists respond. If I were elected king, here are the 3 things I would do to solve this problem.
Okay, we're going to end on that because we're getting close to 9 o'clock. So let's each go. I'm going to go last. Go ahead. Terry, you start.
I've never wanted to be king, ever. It's a bad move. What I would do in terms of the sorts of things that I talked about in terms of the geopolitics and energy security, I'm rather pessimistic at a certain level because it's sort of the way I close my talk. There's so much of it outside our boundaries and outside of our controls that I don't know exactly what one might do. But I can think of, for one thing, I think Churchill said it. It was diversify, diversify, diversify. Change as much as you can in terms of the fuel sources you're dependent upon. I would try to, in terms of some of the things like pipeline disruptions and choke point blockages like the Strait of Hormuz and things like that, I think it would be smart for us to establish or figure out if we could have some sort of multilateral task force that could tend to some of those issues. Might be multinational. And maybe better diplomacy. And I'm not always a great fan of diplomacy, but I think that there are some in this arena that there are some things that could be done that could be helpful to us down the road in terms of securing our energy.
The first thing I would do is pass a law that, or make fuel flexibility a standard feature in every car sold in America. In other words, like seat belts or airbags. It's a very small, cheap feature, And I think it should be a standardized feature in every car on the road, because that will give you, once you have millions of cars that have the capability, that gives incentive to the market to bring the fuel, it gives incentive to the distributors to offer the pumps and the infrastructure. So you gotta produce the chicken, otherwise you're never gonna get an egg. So we really need to start with a chicken, and I think that's a low-hanging fruit. It's a chicken, and then we take it one step further. We need to invest a lot of money in battery technology. $30 million is not enough. Much more needs to go into battery technology. Third thing I would say I would do is tell people the truth. Because what happens is our politicians don't tell us the truth. Truth is, it's going to be hot, it's going to be rough, it's going to be unstable, there are going to be supply disruptions. Now, one other thing you can do is to build more robust strategic reserves. I would go to Anwar, for example, and develop it as our strategic petroleum reserve. I wouldn't drill the oil out of there. I just develop it, and that could be our blood bank. So if one day Al-Qaeda decides to blow up Ras Tanura, we have something we can tap into beyond the SPR. I would also encourage other countries to have strategic reserves. One of the things happening is, the suppliers, the Saudi Arabias of the world, they don't have a liquidity anymore that they used to in the past. So somebody needs to come up with an extra mechanism of liquidity, and it's only going to be the consumers that can do it today. So we need to decide that we create a mechanism that allow us to go through this very long period in which we'll have a lot of disruptions. And how are we going to deal with supply disruptions so our economy doesn't go into a turmoil every time that somebody decides to do a coup or a terror attack or a hurricane or you name it. So these are three things I would do.
Okay, so in 1971, I was elected student body president of my high school, and it was the same year that I discovered that I liked physics much better than politics. And so I don't want to be president of anything, not even an oil company, actually. But no, I think it's technology. I like technology, and I think technology is where we can find the answers. It doesn't solve all problems immediately, but technology over time solves problems. It creates efficiencies, and you can see this. I mean, the first steam engines that were built were hundreds of times less efficient than modern steam turbines today. It's technology, it's experience, it's doing things. We were talking earlier. It's the not quite right hybrids today that are laying the groundwork for the probably much better plug-in hybrids tomorrow. And it's the not quite right corn-based ethanol today that's laying the groundwork for some smarter biomass-based fuel that truly is sustainable tomorrow. And when I look around the world, this is where I see the future is. This is one of the reasons why Shell decided to take a vice president and drop them into MIT as a scientist and go be a scientist at MIT and see what kinds of different solutions we get around energy and think a little bit differently about our problems. And when I look at how this is being played out in different circles, I see four different models at work in politics, in different businesses, and society. There's a whole group of people that I guess they realize the problems are complex, but they don't want to mess with them, so they just bury their head in the sand and ignore it. Now, I don't want global warming to happen. So I'm not even going to think about whether it's true or not. I'm just going to ignore it and figure that if I'm not paying attention, it probably won't happen. I'll just bury my head in the sand and hopefully it'll go away. Then there's a whole other crowd that figures the future is actually easy to predict. I can just extrapolate the past and I'll get there. So I'll pick whatever things I like out of the past and extrapolate them into the future and make it look good or bad as my model. And that's fine too, I guess. There's a whole other bunch that actually admits they're hard problems and they're clueless as to how to solve them, so they don't do anything. And then there's a bunch of people that figure it's a hard problem, we just have to work at it. And we're going to solve these problems not all at once with some silver magic bullet, but we're going to innovate and we're going to evolve, and it's going to be a little bit here and a little bit there. And yes, it's going to take ethanol, and then it's going to take some other biofuel, and then it's going to take a little bit of solar and a little bit of wind and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And 50 years from now, we'll probably be in a different place than we are today. And it will take 50 years to get there. These are national, international scale infrastructure things that just take a long time to create. That's where I am.
You just confirmed my point. The scientists don't want to be politicians.
Thank you.
So I agree with Richard, but I have a more specific view of what the technology would be. Because as Gal explained to you, we generate electricity in this country with no oil. We use, I don't know, a dozen different kinds of fuels, and some of them in larger, coal unfortunately in a larger extent than others, right? But so my feeling is the building block is I have to be able to plug in my car, right? We already know how we're going to do that, and maybe the technology is not quite perfected. And we were saying tonight at dinner that maybe today's hybrids are like, you know, your first laptop. We're going to get to something the size of Gal's BlackBerry, right? But I want to build on that first, because once I do that, then as I take the 50 years to transition the electricity sector to cleaner fuels over time, right, I run the possibility that I will have solved the whole thing as I move electricity over time to something cleaner, more manageable, like solar, or even biofuels maybe is more practical as a feedstock for electricity than it is for fuel for your car, right? So that's my transition. We start by plugging in our car, so we have, as Gal said, the choice. And then we get Apollo program like NASA. We sit down and we think about how we're going to make this electricity in a manner that's different than the way we're making it today. And maybe not necessarily in a power station. Maybe I'm making it in my house, right? And maybe I'm storing it with a battery in my house. So with that, we all have the last word. We're not going to let you all comment now. We really thank you all for coming tonight. It was really a pleasure. We hope to see you at future events. I'd like to thank the panel again for their time. Thank you very much.